When you're 61, you think you've lived through enough heartbreaks to stop being surprised by pain. Your body slows down, people drift away, life gets quieter, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for that one short text that came through on a rainy Thursday morning while I stood barefoot in my kitchen, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee and watching the steam fade into the silence of another lonely day. "You're not invited. We don't want you there." That's all it said. 10 words from my daughter. 10 sharp, deliberate little cuts that left me breathless. My thumb hovered over the screen, trembling as if rereading it might somehow change what was written. But it didn't. Her name, Layla, glowed on the top of the message like a cruel reminder of everything I thought we still shared. I froze right there, the clock ticking louder than it should have, the fridge humming like it was mocking me, and the faint tapping of rain against the window somehow sounding like applause for the show I'd just been kicked out of. I couldn't cry. Not yet. It was as if my brain and heart had called an emergency meeting, and both decided to shut down until further notice. "You have to understand, Layla is my only child. I became her mother when I was just 29. After a difficult pregnancy that nearly took me off this earth, she was my everything, my miracle baby. The one good thing that came out of a marriage that drained me of nearly everything else. And now, more than 30 years later, she was telling me I was no longer welcome. No explanation, no reason, just that I was not wanted." I sat down at the kitchen table, still wearing my robe, still trying to make sense of it. The text glared at me from the phone like it wanted to start a fight. I reread it again. I checked the number. Maybe it was a mistake, a prank. Maybe someone else had her phone. I tapped out a reply with shaking fingers. "Layla, what's going on? Did I do something wrong?" I stared at the blinking cursor, then hit send. 5 minutes passed. Nothing. 10. Still nothing. I imagined her phone lighting up and her seeing my name, rolling her eyes and turning it over like I didn't matter anymore. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was the memories flooding back all at once. I remembered the way she used to sneak into my bed during thunderstorms, wrapping her little arms around my neck and whispering, "You're my safe place, Mommy." I remembered her 8th birthday when I stayed up all night sewing sequins onto a homemade unicorn costume because she didn't want a store-bought one like the other kids. I remembered every scraped knee, every bedtime song, every proud photo taped to the fridge. I wasn't a perfect mom. I've yelled, I've cried in front of her, I've burned more than a few dinners, but I loved her with everything I had, always. So what could have possibly happened to make her cut me off like this? What had I missed? Did I say something wrong at our last dinner? Had someone told her something about me that wasn't true? My mind spun in circles, chasing answers I didn't have. I scrolled through our last messages. 2 weeks ago, I'd sent her a photo of the little garden I'd been working on. She hadn't replied. Before that, I'd asked if she wanted to come over for dinner. Again, no response. At the time, I told myself she was just busy. Work, life, whatever. Now I saw the truth. The distance wasn't accidental. She was pulling away, purposefully. And this message wasn't just about a birthday or a party. It was about something bigger, something darker. I got up, walked to the sink, and dumped the coffee. My hands were still shaking, and my heart was pounding in a way that made me feel like I was back in my 20s, waiting for my husband to come home, drunk and angry. That kind of fear, the kind that crawls up from your belly and settles behind your ribs. I thought I'd left it behind when I left him, but now it was back. In a new form, rejection, from the person I loved most. I called her. It rang twice. Then voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't trust my voice not to break. Instead, I got in my car and just started driving. I didn't have a destination in mind. I passed the grocery store, the post office, the diner where Layla and I used to get pie on Sundays when she was little. I drove past the park where she took her first steps. The old elementary school that still had her graduation banner faded on the wall. All those places that used to feel warm now felt cold. Eventually, I pulled into the lot behind the church, not for religious comfort. I'm not that kind of woman anymore, but because it was quiet and empty, and I needed somewhere to fall apart. And that's exactly what I did. I sat in the car, head on the steering wheel, and sobbed like I hadn't cried in years. I didn't know why she hated me. But I knew I had to find out, because something about this wasn't right. This wasn't my daughter. This wasn't how she would act. Someone, or something, had gotten to her, and I was going to find out what, even if it tore me apart in the process. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click unevenly, like a heartbeat that had lost its rhythm, just spinning and spinning above me. The room too hot, the blankets too heavy, my thoughts louder than any noise outside. I kept checking my phone, praying for a text, a call, anything that might undo what she said, but nothing came. At around 3 a.m., I gave up and walked out onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket like armor, holding a cup of tea I didn't really want. The air was damp, the sky overcast and low, and even the crickets sounded tired. I kept replaying her words in my head. We don't want you there. Not just I. We. That little word did something to me. It told me she wasn't alone in this. Someone else was behind it. Someone was in her ear, and I had a sinking suspicion I knew exactly who. See, I left Layla's father when she was 11. It wasn't a dramatic exit, not the kind you see in movies with screaming and suitcases flung into the night. No, it was quiet, methodical. I had to be careful. He had a temper. Not the kind that left bruises on your skin, but the kind that left you questioning your own memory. I didn't tell Layla the whole truth. I couldn't. At that age, children don't need to know the ways their parents fail each other behind closed doors. I just told her we needed space, that I loved her, that I wasn't going far. But after I left, he remarried faster than anyone expected. Her name was Karen, the kind of woman who smiles with her mouth but not her eyes, who always smelled like money and manipulation. Layla liked her at first, and why wouldn't she? Karen bought her things, complimented her, made her feel important, but there was something about her. Slick, too polished, too calculated. I tried to stay polite for Layla's sake, but every time I picked her up for the weekend, Karen would say something with that passive-aggressive sweetness that made my skin crawl. Things like, "Oh, she didn't bring her coat again? You must have forgotten again." Or, "We had such a nice time baking cookies. Layla said you never let her eat sugar." It was always little things, small cuts that didn't bleed right away, but left bruises under the surface. And over time, Layla started looking at me differently. Not angry, exactly, just distant. Like she was studying me through a lens someone else had smudged. I tried everything to keep our connection. Birthday cards, surprise visits at school with her favorite lunch, weekend trips to the lake. But even then, she started pulling away. Once, when she was 15, I asked her why she was so quiet, and she said, "You wouldn't understand. Karen listens," and that broke me more than anything, because I had always listened. I just never bought her silence with glitter. Now, almost 15 years later, I was starting to wonder what Karen had been whispering all this time. The next morning, I called Debbie, my oldest friend, someone who's known me since we were both waitressing at the bowling alley in the late 80s, long before either of us had kids or gray hair. Debbie's the kind of woman who doesn't sugarcoat anything. She's seen me through every mistake I ever made and still picks up the phone when I call. She answered on the first ring. "You sound like hell," she said, and I didn't even try to laugh. I just told her what happened, reading the message aloud with a voice that cracked halfway through. There was a pause. Then she said, "Martha, I probably should have told you this sooner. A few months ago, I ran into Layla. We chatted for a bit, but she said something strange. She told me you stole money from her father, that you drained the account and ran. She said she has proof." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What? That's a lie. I would never—" "I know," Debbie cut in. "That's why I didn't believe it. But she seemed so sure, like it was something she'd carried for years. She said Karen showed her paperwork, bank statements, emails, something." My head was spinning. This couldn't be happening. Not just the heartbreak, but the realization that Layla didn't just forget me. She'd been actively turned against me. I tried to think back. Had there been joint accounts? Yes. One, a savings account we opened when we were married, but it had barely anything in it when I left. I took what was mine, fair and square, and there were no emails, no digital trails back then, not that she could have seen. So where did this proof come from? That's when it hit me. Karen. Karen had access to everything. She could have forged emails, printed false bank statements. She had the means and the motive. And Layla? Layla would have believed her. especially when she was still hurting, still trying to make sense of why her mother walked out and left her in a house filled with tension and silk curtains. I felt this mix of rage and guilt burning in my throat. Rage at Karen for lying, and guilt for giving her the silence she needed to fill in the blanks with her own poison. I opened my laptop and started digging. Old files, legal folders, anything that might prove what really happened. But my records were incomplete. Most of the papers were boxed up in the attic, probably collecting dust and mouse droppings. Still, I wasn't going to let this lie stand. Not anymore. I was done being the villain in a story I didn't write. There's a particular kind of pain that settles into your chest when you realize someone's been carefully, methodically rewriting your story while you were too busy surviving to notice, and that pain took root deep inside me as I sat cross-legged in my dusty attic, the early morning light sneaking in through a narrow window and catching the floating specks in the air, giving everything a ghostly, suspended feel, like even time had stopped to watch me uncover what I should have never had to prove. Surrounded by old boxes marked with fading Sharpie, I sifted through the life I'd stored away. Years of tax papers, birthday cards with crayon handwriting, medical forms, even Layla's first drawing of a cat that looked more like a melted potato. And finally, I found the manila folder I hadn't touched in over 2 decades, the one labeled Separation, 1997, thin but powerful, containing the truth no one had ever asked me for. The documents inside were yellowed at the edges, but intact, and as I spread them out on the floor, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and satisfaction. Here it was, the financial record of my exit, clean and legal and heartbreakingly ignored, showing every penny accounted for. No theft, no secrets, just a woman who'd had enough and walked away with what little dignity she could carry. I sat there for a while, cross-legged and stiff, the silence of the attic pressing down on me like a weight, wondering how something as solid as truth could be so easy to bury when lies wore prettier makeup and came wrapped in designer perfume and polite smiles. It wasn't the first time I'd thought about Karen, but it was the first time I really let myself feel the fury, not the soft ache of jealousy I'd once carried when she stepped into Layla's life like some polished savior with her spotless floors and over-groomed poodle, but real, bone-deep fury that she had dared to tell my daughter stories that turned me into the villain of my own life. I didn't call ahead, I didn't warn anyone, and I didn't bring flowers or pleasantries. I simply printed copies of the key documents, slid them into a fresh envelope, put on the one clean blazer I hadn't donated to Goodwill, and drove to the house I used to call home. The one I left behind, not because I stopped loving it, but because I couldn't survive inside it any longer. It was strange driving up that street again. Everything was familiar, but colder, more curated, like someone had taken a red pen to the past and edited out all the parts with me in it. And as I parked across from the beige 2-story with the manicured bushes and the expensive car in the driveway, I could already feel my hands beginning to sweat. I took a deep breath, grabbed the envelope like it was a shield, crossed the street with slow, steady steps, and knocked on the door I once opened 100 times, with groceries in one arm and Layla's hand in the other. And when it swung open, there she was, Karen, in a crisp blouse and pearl earrings, holding a mug that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, smiling in that tight, non-committal way that says, "I'm in control, and you are not welcome." Her voice was syrupy and fake as ever, and she didn't even blink when she said, "Well, this is unexpected," like she hadn't spent years poisoning my daughter against me one passive-aggressive comment at a time. I ignored the pleasantries and got straight to the point, telling her I needed to speak to Layla, that I had something important to show her, something that would finally give her the truth she deserved. But Karen simply leaned her shoulder against the frame and replied, with that same sugar-laced venom, "She's not here," even though I could see Layla's car parked just 10 feet away. I told her I knew she was lying, that Layla was inside, and that I wasn't leaving without trying to speak to her. And Karen's lips curled ever so slightly as she said, "She doesn't want to see you. She asked me not to let you in." Those words hit me harder than I expected, not just because they were cruel, but because deep down, part of me feared they were true. And yet, Something inside me said no. That voice doesn't belong to my daughter. It belongs to the person feeding her scripts. I tried again, softer this time, telling her I wasn't here to fight, that I just wanted Layla to see what I brought. Real proof, not hearsay or twisted stories, just cold facts. But Karen glanced at the envelope like it was garbage and said she already knows everything she needs to know. Then something shifted, a presence behind her, a shadow in the hallway, and Layla stepped into view, barefoot, holding a mug, her face unreadable, her eyes tired. My heart jumped to my throat, and I took a step forward, ignoring Karen entirely, my voice shaking as I said, "Sweetheart, please, just give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." She didn't respond. She didn't move. She just stared at me like I was a stranger on her doorstep selling lies. And then, the part that broke me into pieces, she gave the smallest, saddest nod. Not to me, but to Karen. And with that, the door slowly began to close. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just stood there, frozen, as the door shut in my face, and the only sound left was the envelope slipping from my hand and the soft rustle of papers scattering across the porch like leaves caught in a dying wind. I knelt slowly, my knees stiff, gathering the pages one by one as my vision blurred and my chest tightened with something beyond pain. It was helplessness, rage, grief, all tangled together, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't even cry. I walked back to my car in a daze, gripping the envelope like it could still save me, and sat there staring at the steering wheel as tears finally spilled over in thick, hot silence. That woman had stolen more than my place at the dinner table. She had stolen my story, turned my daughter into someone who saw me through her words, not her own memories. And the part that scared me most was that Layla seemed to believe it. But I wasn't done. I wasn't broken. I was going to find a way to make her see who I really was. Not with anger or accusations, but with truth. Because even the most twisted story can't survive forever once the truth begins to breathe. For the next few days, I moved through my life like a ghost, functioning just enough to keep the lights on and the coffee brewed. But I was hollow on the inside, like something had been scooped out of me and replaced with static. I'd wake up with a tight knot in my chest, check my phone hoping for a message that never came, stare at the walls until the sun moved, and wonder how many lies had to be told before my daughter saw me as a stranger. The silence between us wasn't just hurtful, it was dangerous, because in the absence of real memory, someone else had built a story in Layla's mind, and from what I could see, she had accepted it like gospel. I couldn't let that stand. So I did what I hadn't done in years. I started digging, not through old boxes this time, but through conversation, through records, through fragments of the past I'd been too afraid to revisit. I called a friend I hadn't spoken to in a decade, a woman named Angela, who used to work at the bank where Layla's father and I held our joint account. And though she was hesitant at first, her voice softened when I explained the situation. She remembered me, remembered the day I closed out my portion of the account and transferred my half into a separate savings account to start over. She even remembered how scared I looked standing at her desk, trying to act brave while my hands trembled. "You didn't take a dime more than what was yours, Martha," she said. "I remember because you asked me 3 times to double-check the numbers." That confirmation made me want to cry and scream at the same time, because somewhere in Layla's mind was a version of that story that had been twisted into theft, into betrayal, and I had let it happen by staying quiet for too long. I asked Angela if she could access any old statements, but she said the system had changed years ago and most files were digitalized or destroyed, though she did offer to call someone she knew from the archives department to see what was still retrievable. I thanked her and hung up, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, small but steady. If I could find even one document with a timestamp, something that couldn't be forged or manipulated, I could start to crack the narrative that had been built against me. Later that afternoon, I decided to visit someone I'd almost forgotten about, not because she didn't matter, but because I'd assumed she'd long moved on. Her name was Beth, and she used to be Layla's babysitter back when I was working 2 shifts at the diner and needed someone to keep her safe after school. Beth was in her late 30s now, married with 2 boys of her own, but when she saw me standing on her porch, she didn't hesitate to pull me into a hug. We sat at her kitchen table, the smell of banana bread in the oven and the sound of cartoons echoing faintly from the other room, and I told her everything, the message. The door slammed in my face. The silence, the lies. She listened with wide, shocked eyes, and then she said something that made my heart stop. "You know, I always thought it was weird how Karen used to show up when I babysat," she said. "She'd bring Layla little gifts, tell her she was prettier than her mom ever gave her credit for, say things like, 'One day I'll show you what a real mother does.' At the time, I just thought she was trying too hard to be liked. But now," her voice trailed off, and she looked genuinely disturbed by her own memories. She excused herself and came back a few minutes later holding a dusty box. "I kept some of the notes Layla left behind. She used to draw all over the backs of my son's homework," she said, smiling. She was always leaving little hearts and scribbles. As I sorted through the pages, my hands shaking slightly, I found something folded twice and stained in one corner. I opened it carefully. It was a crayon drawing of two women, one with short hair holding a balloon, and one taller with red X's over her face. Above it, in crooked block letters, Layla had written, "Karen says mommy lies. She said daddy cries because of mommy." My stomach turned. This wasn't just suggestion. This was indoctrination. Karen had started planting seeds when Layla was barely old enough to spell. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the house quiet, except for the occasional creak of old floorboards, and I looked through the folder of documents again, this time not as a desperate mother trying to defend herself, but as a woman preparing for war. I pulled out the crayon drawing and tucked it between two pages, along with the court document showing I left the marriage legally and without financial foul play. Then I opened a blank note card and began writing, not a letter of apology, but a letter of clarity. I kept my tone steady, not pleading. I told her I had never stolen anything. I told her I never stopped loving her. I told her she deserved the truth, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it made her question everything she'd been told. I didn't expect her to read it. I didn't even expect her to open the envelope. But I needed her to have it. I drove to her apartment, the one she moved into after college, the one I helped her paint in pale blue because she said it made her feel calm. And I slid the envelope under her door just after midnight, the hallway quiet, the air heavy with whatever storm was coming next. As I walked back to my car, my heart pounding, my hands cold, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not peace, but something close to power. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to pain, I was pushing back. Let them lie. Let them twist the story. I was done being silent, and the truth was just beginning to find its voice. The morning after I slipped the envelope under Layla's door, I barely slept. My eyes may have closed for an hour or two, but my thoughts ran like freight trains through every corner of my mind, crashing into memories I hadn't touched in years and shaking loose every fear I'd tried to bury. I kept seeing her face behind the door, blank and distant, and wondering whether the words I left on those pages could reach past everything that woman had put between us. As the hours dragged by without a message or call, I sank deeper into a kind of quiet despair. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the hollow one, where your body goes through the motions while your spirit just waits for something to change. That afternoon, as a storm rolled somewhere off in the distance, and the clouds began stacking over the rooftops like waiting judgment, I felt pulled toward the garage, without really deciding to go there, like something inside me knew it was time. The garage was cluttered and stale, smelling of old oil and forgotten summers, every shelf stacked with the pieces of a life no one had needed in years, and in the far corner under a warped old bookshelf, I found a row of boxes I hadn't opened since I left my marriage. Most were labeled in my old handwriting, quick and impatient, but one had something different scrawled across the top in red marker. Not my hand, not my words, just 3 crooked letters. M. Personal. Inside that box, tucked between manila folders and brittle photo envelopes, was a small plastic case sealed with brittle tape. The plastic was cloudy, warped from heat or time, and I hesitated before opening it, because somehow I knew this wasn't just old receipts or expired documents. This was something that had been hidden for a reason. When I finally peeled the tape back and opened the case, I found dozens of letters, all addressed to Layla, some handwritten, some typed, many never finished or never signed. Some were in birthday cards, others tucked into folded notebook pages, and each one was marked with the kind of emotional fingerprints only a mother could leave behind. A smudge of lipstick, a water stain that had blurred the ink, a small pressed flower between the folds. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. These were letters I had written over the years but never delivered, not because I didn't want to, but because they never reached her. And then I noticed something else. Nearly all of them had sticky notes or labels on the front, written in a sharp, unfamiliar hand, saying things like, "Return to sender," or "Do not forward." That handwriting didn't belong to me. I didn't need to guess whose it was. I had seen that smug, perfect slant on Christmas cards and school permission slips. It was Karen's. The realization hit like a wave crashing over my chest. She had intercepted them. Somehow she had found a way to block the letters I sent. Or maybe she'd pressured Layla's father into returning them. Maybe even told him what to say. But either way, Layla never saw them. All this time, I had thought maybe she didn't care. Maybe she didn't want me anymore. But the truth was far more cruel. Someone had made sure she wouldn't know I had never stopped trying. Among those letters, there was one that caught my attention immediately. It was thicker, wrapped in a sheet of paper that had yellowed at the corners, and inside was a full typed account of what happened during the custody hearings, including legal notes, visitation schedules, even a printout of a court document that stated I was denied shared custody based on unconfirmed allegations, language that Karen had likely planted through well-placed whispers and polished performances. Tucked into that same envelope was a copy of an old voicemail, something I'd saved on a whim years ago, from Layla's father, left by accident, his voice slurring as he mumbled about how Karen had handled all the legal paperwork and how I'd never know what hit me. As I sat there on the cold garage floor, holding the past in my hands, the wind outside picked up, the trees shaking like they knew what was coming, and I realized I had enough. Not enough to fix everything, not yet, but enough to force open a crack in the story that had buried me. I gathered the most important pages, slid them into a clean envelope, and added the old crayon drawing Beth had found, the one with Karen smiling, and my face crossed out. And I called Layla, not with a speech prepared, not with a plan, but with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd still pick up. To my shock, she did. Her voice was quiet and cautious, like she was answering a call from a number she wasn't sure she wanted to see. And though her words were few and hesitant, there was something in her tone that didn't sound like anger. It sounded like fear, like a part of her didn't want to keep living in this half-truth anymore. I asked her to come. I didn't beg or explain. I just said that I had something of hers, something important, and that she deserved to see it with her own eyes. After I hung up, the next hour passed in slow motion. I sat by the window with the envelope on my lap, listening to the wind press against the glass, thinking about what I would say if she came, wondering if I should say anything at all. When I finally saw her car pull into the driveway, my breath caught, and for a split second, I wasn't 61 anymore. I was a young mother again, waiting for her little girl to run into her arms. Layla didn't get out right away. She sat in the car with her hands on the wheel, staring at the house like it held something sacred or dangerous, or both. Then, just as the rain began to fall in light, hesitant drops, she stepped out and walked slowly to the door. I opened it before she could knock and said nothing, just handed her the envelope and led her to the table where I used to pack her school lunches. She sat in silence, her posture stiff, her fingers hesitating on the seal before she opened it and began reading. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just watched as her expression shifted from guarded to confused, then to something I hadn't seen in years. Pain, real and raw, and rippling across her face like a tide she couldn't stop. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the drawing. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the court document. And then, as she listened to the voicemail on my old phone, played on low volume, her whole body tensed. For a terrifying moment, I thought she might scream, accuse me of forging it all, storm out and slam the door behind her, and the tension in the air was so thick it felt like one wrong breath might snap everything. But then something shifted. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just sat back slowly in the chair, her shoulders slumping like someone who'd been holding up the world for far too long, and she covered her face with her hands. It was in that moment that everything teetered on the edge. She could have shut down, rejected it, clung to the version of reality she knew, but she didn't. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but clear, and the only thing she said was a whisper I could barely hear, but I felt it in my bones. She hadn't known. Not really. Not fully. And now, she couldn't unknow it. I didn't hug her. I didn't reach across the table. I just stayed still, letting the silence carry the weight of everything between us. And in that silence, something fragile and miraculous began to breathe. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something just as rare. The beginning of truth. The next morning felt different. Not in the way a storm lifts or a wound suddenly heals, but in that quiet, uncertain way when something long buried has finally been unearthed, and now just lies there between you and the person you love, exposed and pulsing in the open air. I didn't sleep much after Layla left. She hadn't said much, hadn't hugged me, hadn't made any promises, but the way she looked at me before stepping out, like a wall had cracked just enough to let the light through. That look stayed with me through the night, burning brighter than hope but colder than comfort. I didn't know if she'd call again or if the box had changed anything for good, but something in my bones told me she wasn't going to let it rest, not after what she'd seen with her own eyes. By mid-morning, I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing out the same teacup for the third time, when my phone lit up with her name. Not a call, but a message. Short and cautious, saying she needed time, that she was trying to understand everything, that she wasn't ready to talk face to face again yet, but she wasn't shutting the door either. And that, for now, was more than I'd expected. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel just the edge of relief. I didn't know it then, but Layla had already started asking questions. Later, I found out she'd gone back to the house that same afternoon, the one she'd lived in with her father and Karen, and from the moment she stepped inside, she said something felt off, not visually. Nothing had moved or changed. But in that subtle, emotional shift, when you begin to look at your surroundings not as a home, but as a crime scene, as a place that might have been constructed to deceive rather than to shelter. She told me later that Karen greeted her with a wide smile and a glass of white wine, just like always, asking if everything was okay in that carefully concerned tone she used like a weapon wrapped in silk. Layla hadn't said much. She'd played it neutral, asking about some old files, curious about her childhood artwork, wondering out loud if any of her old letters or drawings were still packed away somewhere. Karen had laughed, gently and dismissively, the way she always did when she was cornered, saying there wasn't much left, that things had been misplaced during one of the garage cleanups years ago. But Layla noticed something strange. Karen's hand had tightened around the wine glass just slightly, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. That same evening, Layla called her father, something she rarely did anymore, and asked him plainly if he remembered the custody agreement, if he remembered why the court denied joint rights. She told me his answer came too quickly, like something memorized, and it was almost word for word what Karen had told her growing up, that I had become unstable, emotionally erratic, that I'd withdrawn large sums of money and vanished. But now, with the documents in her hands, Layla heard the falseness in his voice, the hesitation behind the certainty, and for the first time in her adult life, she began to wonder how much of what she'd been told was ever true. She texted me the next morning, asking for a copy of the signed custody denial, not just the one I'd shown her, but the court-certified original. I found it, scanned it, and sent it within the hour. She didn't respond right away, but 2 days later, she sent another message, longer this time, explaining that she had confronted Karen with what she'd read. She didn't accuse her outright, didn't shout or demand a confession. She simply placed the papers on the kitchen counter and watched her reaction. Karen had frozen, not visibly, not in a movie-like way, but Layla said there was something too slow, too rehearsed in the way she picked up the pages, squinted at them and said, almost casually, that they must have been forged. That was Karen's mistake, because she didn't ask any questions. She didn't act surprised or confused. She didn't even wonder where the documents had come from. And Layla noticed that one moment, that instinctive denial without curiosity, is what cracked the rest of the shell. Layla didn't push further in that moment, didn't argue, but she told me that as she drove away that night, the house she'd once called her sanctuary felt suddenly unfamiliar, like a set designed for someone else's life, and the woman she'd looked up to for most of her adult years began to seem more like an actress than a mother figure. The next time Layla came to see me, it was late in the evening, after the sky had already dimmed and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and warm asphalt. I didn't ask her what she'd found. I didn't reach for her or pressure her with soft looks. I just made tea and set it on the table like I used to when she came home from school. And I waited. She sat quietly for a while, her fingers running along the wood grain of the table, and then, without preamble, she said she didn't know who to believe anymore, that everything felt tangled, backwards, like the ground under her feet had shifted and no one had warned her. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to figure it all out right away, that she didn't need to take sides or assign blame in a single sitting, but before I could open my mouth, she told me she had gone back to the garage, the same garage where she'd once stored her school projects and boxes of old art, and that behind a stack of seasonal decorations, in an unlabeled bin, she'd found a bundle of letters. My letters, ones I had mailed but never got replies to. She recognized my handwriting instantly, the same way I used to label her lunch containers, and it was in that moment that she said something inside her cracked wide open. I watched her eyes grow damp as she spoke, her voice steady, but full of emotion she wasn't letting spill yet. And then something unexpected happened, a sound from the hallway, a creak on the stairs. And for a moment, we both turned sharply toward the door, hearts leaping, unsure if someone was there. It turned out to be nothing, an old pipe settling maybe, but the fear that rushed through me in that instant felt like something primal, a reminder of how fragile peace is when everything still teeters on the edge. But that edge was no longer razor sharp. Layla looked at me for a long time after the silence returned, her hands clasped around the tea like she was grounding herself, and though she didn't say she forgave me, didn't say she believed everything just yet, there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not distance, not pity, but something softer, like the beginning of understanding. We sat together for a while longer, the words slowing, the space between us still cautious, but no longer cold. And as the evening deepened and the lights cast long shadows across the room, I realized that the truth, once quiet and powerless, had finally found its way into the room with us. It hadn't burned down the lies yet, but it had lit the first match. There's something eerie about the moment before a truth breaks loose, like the air itself senses what's coming and pulls back in silence, holding its breath while everyone else goes about their lives unaware that someone's world is about to split open. That was the feeling I had all day as I waited, pacing from room to room with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional creak of the house settling around me. I didn't know what Layla was planning or how far she was willing to go, but the way she had looked at me the night before, tired, torn, but open, told me that whatever came next, she wasn't going to look away anymore. She didn't tell me her plan, but I found out later that she had invited Karen over for what she said would be a simple talk. Karen agreed, of course. She was never one to turn down an opportunity to keep control of the narrative. Layla chose a quiet corner of a local cafe, not their usual spot, not a place with sentiment attached, just neutral ground with plain tables and weak coffee, where nothing could distract from what needed to be said. Layla didn't open with accusations. She didn't storm in with papers or angry questions. Instead, she asked Karen about the past, about the letters, about why certain things didn't add up. She kept her tone soft, almost curious, and that's what made it work. Karen, always the performer, always prepared for a fight, didn't know what to do with calm, steady questions. She dodged them at first, leaned into vague memories and gentle denials, tried to make it sound like everything was simply a misunderstanding or a matter of perspective. But Layla didn't back down. She brought out the letters, not all of them, just 2 or 3. Ones Karen couldn't explain away. She brought up the court document, the official one, and pointed out that it didn't match the story she had grown up hearing. And then, most importantly, she mentioned the voicemail, casually, as if wondering aloud how it had survived all these years. and watched the way Karen's eyes flickered just a little too fast. According to Layla, it was in that flicker, that millisecond of panic, where everything finally snapped into place. Karen hadn't expected her to go digging. She hadn't expected the letters to resurface, or for the voice of a drunken man from years ago to echo into the present with enough force to fracture the lie she had so carefully constructed. But the real mistake came when Karen tried to pivot, tried to play the wounded stepmother who had only ever tried to protect Layla from disappointment, who had stepped in when I supposedly walked out. She painted herself as the rescuer once again. But this time, Layla saw through it, saw the holes, the inconsistencies, the way Karen's words never seemed to hold up when held against anything real. Later that night, Layla told me everything. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just sat on my couch, curled in the corner like she used to when she was little, holding a mug of tea she never sipped from, and told me how surreal it had felt to realize that so much of her understanding of me had come from someone else's mouth, not her own memories. She said that now, when she closed her eyes and tried to remember her childhood, she no longer saw just the bad moments Karen had described. She saw flashes of warmth, of car rides where we sang to old pop songs, of nights spent watching the same movie 3 times in a row just because she liked the way I said the lines out loud. She told me she didn't know how to process the guilt, not just over believing Karen for so long, but for the things she'd said to me, the coldness she'd carried like armor. And even though I wanted to tell her she didn't need to apologize, that none of it was her fault, I let her speak, let her purge the years of tangled emotion that had weighed down her heart. She needed to say it out loud, and I needed to hear it. In that same breath, she told me she didn't want to go back to the house. Not now. Not ever. She didn't feel safe there anymore. Not physically, but emotionally. The entire space felt like a museum of someone else's memories, a version of her life that had been curated without her permission. I offered her the guest room here. It wasn't much, but it was warm, quiet, and hers if she wanted it. She hesitated at first, probably more out of pride than anything else. But before the night ended, she had taken off her shoes and folded herself into the old quilt I kept on the couch. As I stood in the hallway watching her drift into sleep, her face soft, her breathing steady, I realized we weren't just recovering what had been lost. We were building something new. It wasn't perfect. There were still bruises beneath the surface, wounds we hadn't even named yet, but they were ours to tend to now, without interference, without performance, without someone else pulling the strings. And the next morning, when Layla came into the kitchen barefoot, hair messy, wearing one of my oversized flannel shirts and blinking against the sunlight, it hit me all at once, not just the relief that she was back, but the full weight of what we had almost lost. She looked at me with tired but honest eyes, and in that quiet moment between boiling water and buttered toast, she said something that wasn't a declaration or a promise, just a simple, steady truth that settled into my chest like warmth after a long winter. She was ready to start again. As the weeks stretched into months, life around me began to resemble something I'd almost forgotten how to feel. Steady, unhurried, warm in small but vital ways. Mornings filled with quiet rituals, dinners shared without tension, the occasional laugh that came from deep in the chest instead of just brushing the surface. Layla, though still hesitant in certain moments, had begun to soften, not into the child I once knew, but into a woman rebuilding her own memory from the ashes of someone else's version. Her presence in my home no longer felt borrowed or uncertain. It felt like something earned, something right. Karen, for a while, disappeared from our world completely. After Layla refused her calls and tucked away the final letter unopened, I thought perhaps she'd finally accepted the loss of her influence. But as it turned out, people like Karen don't go quietly. They wait, they watch, and when they feel power slipping through their fingers, they strike where they think it will still hurt. It began with a call from Layla's HR department. Someone had anonymously submitted a complaint about ethical concerns and provided a fabricated email claiming Layla had tampered with legal documents, specifically regarding me. They said she helped falsify financial papers to protect her unstable mother. Layla was stunned. She knew immediately who had sent it, though it came from a nameless account. It was classic Karen. Petty, indirect, and laced with just enough detail to stir doubt. The HR office wasn't taking any action yet, but the damage was psychological. Layla came home that night pale and shaken, whispering that maybe Karen was going to destroy her career the same way she'd tried to destroy our family. I couldn't let it stand. The next morning, I pulled out the box again, not the one with the letters, but the one I'd kept locked for years, the one filled with legal correspondence, old emails, and, most importantly, the original handwritten notes from Karen during the custody battle. There, among the scanned court files, was something I'd nearly forgotten, a printed memo I'd received from my old attorney, containing an accidental fax Karen had sent to a paralegal. The note included her handwriting, referencing how she'd used the daughter angle to discredit me. At the time, it hadn't changed anything legally, but now it was gold. Layla and I compiled every piece of evidence, the voicemail, the notes, the handwritten memo, even timestamps from the original letters Karen intercepted, and we brought them to a lawyer who specialized in reputation defense and workplace harassment. He was sharp, calm, and had a particular gleam in his eye as he reviewed the materials. What Karen had done wasn't just manipulation, it bordered on character defamation and retaliatory harassment. And if she'd faked documents to harm Layla's employment, that could become criminal. 2 weeks later, Layla's workplace received a legal notice informing them of a pending claim, and the company launched an internal review. Karen was officially named in the investigation. At first, she tried to deny everything, but once she was contacted for a formal interview and asked to verify her identity in connection with the false email, she panicked. In one final act of desperation, she tried to spin it, said she'd only done it out of love, to shake Layla awake before it was too late. But her words were recorded, her tone documented, and her history exposed. The company closed the review with full exoneration for Layla and a private apology from the board. But it didn't stop there. Karen was hit with a cease and desist, along with a defamation warning. And the best part? Her husband, Layla's father, who had quietly tolerated her schemes for years, finally saw the full scope of what she'd done. He filed for divorce, stating in court that he had been manipulated and kept in the dark by a woman who valued control over family. When I heard about it, I didn't smile. Not because she didn't deserve it, but because the pain she caused didn't warrant celebration. It warranted closure. And closure is exactly what we got. Layla, stronger than I'd ever seen her, took a new role at her company shortly after. Not out of pity, but because she'd shown leadership and grace under fire. I saw her give a presentation to a room full of executives, firm, intelligent, compassionate, and I couldn't help but think how lucky the world was to finally see her for who she really was. As for me, something unexpected happened. David, the quiet man from the bookstore with his travel books and worn jackets, had stayed in touch, gently and without pressure. One evening, he brought over soup when I had the flu, and we ended up watching an old black and white film on my couch, laughing about how dramatic everyone was in the 1940s. When Layla walked in that night and saw me curled up under a blanket, smiling like a woman who'd found peace rather than hiding from pain, she simply gave me a little nod, the kind that said, "I see you now, and I'm happy you're here." Now, months later, I've learned something I want to share, something I wish someone had told me back when all I had was silence, and a door slammed in my face by the one person I loved more than life itself. The truth always finds its way. It may take years. It may hide behind faces that smile too sweetly and words that sound just right, but it cannot be buried forever. And if you hold on to yourself,